The cold steel of the shackles bit into Vivian Parker's wrists as she stood trembling on the auction block, her honey blonde hair falling in dirty tangles around her tear-streaked face. The crowd of leering men gathered before her in the dusty streets of Redemption, Colorado, called out crude remarks and bids that made her stomach turn. The year was 1875, and at 22 years old, she never imagined she'd be sold like cattle to pay off her late father's gambling debts. $200 for the pretty little thing, shouted a portly man with tobacco-stained teeth. $250, called another, his eyes roving over her in a way that made her want to disappear into the wooden planks beneath her feet. Vivian fought back tears, determined not to give these strangers the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her father had been gone less than a week, and the creditors had wasted no time in seizing everything including her. With no family and no means to support herself, the law had little sympathy for an unmarried woman with debts to settle. $300. The new voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and commanding. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a pencil mustache, perked up at the higher bid. "I have 300. Do I hear 350? The crowd parted as a tall figure stepped forward. Dust-covered boots, worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and a weathered Stetson that shadowed piercing green eyes. His face was tanned from the sun, with a strong jawline darkened by stubble. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to handling himself in difficult situations. $500, he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "And that's the end of it." The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then recovered quickly. $500 going once. "This ain't right," the stranger continued, stepping closer to the auction block. "No woman should be standing before strangers like this." $600, countered the portly man, glaring at the newcomer. The tall stranger turned, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. "I said that's the end of it." His voice remained level, but there was steel behind it that silenced the crowd. $1,000 and this auction is over. The auctioneer's eyes widened at the sum of small fortune in these parts. $1,000 going once, going twice. "Sold to the gentleman in the back." As the crowd dispersed, grumbling, the stranger approached the block. Up close, Vivian could see the weariness in his eyes, but also a kindness that had been absent in every other face she'd seen that day. "Name's Grant Wilson," he said as the auctioneer hurriedly removed her shackles. "And you'll never stand before strangers like that again, miss. You have my word." Vivian rubbed her raw wrists, staring at the man in disbelief. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." Grant's expression remained unreadable as he offered her his hand to help her down from the platform. "Let's just say I've seen enough injustice in this world to last several lifetimes. Come on, we should get you somewhere safe." Vivian hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. Whatever this man's intentions, they couldn't be worse than what awaited her with the others who had been bidding. As she stepped down, her legs wobbled beneath her, weak from days of poor treatment and the shock of her situation. Grant steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Easy now." "When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning," she admitted. "They said it wasn't worth feeding me since I'd be sold today." A muscle tightened in his jaw. "There's a decent enough place down the street. Let's get some food in you before we figure out what's next." Vivian followed him, acutely aware of the stares from townsfolk as they passed. Some looked at her with pity, others with judgment, and more than a few men glared at Grant with obvious envy or resentment. The restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the aroma of fresh baked bread. Grant led her to a corner table away from the windows and pulled out her chair. Once seated, he removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair with strands of silver at the temples that suggested he was in his mid-30s. "Order whatever you want," he said as a waitress approached. "You need your strength." Vivian ordered stew and bread while Grant asked for coffee. When the waitress left, an awkward silence fell between them. "Mr. Wilson," Vivian finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to thank you, but I also don't understand why you would spend such a sum on a stranger." Grant studied her for a long moment. "Miss Parker." "Vivian Parker." "Miss Parker, I've spent the last 15 years riding from town to town, and I've seen how this country treats those without power. What was happening to you was wrong, plain and simple." "But $1,000 is just money," he interrupted. "It comes, it goes." "But a person's dignity, that's something else entirely." Their conversation paused as the waitress brought Vivian's stew and Grant's coffee. Vivian tried to eat slowly, but hunger got the better of her manners, and she devoured the food as if it might be taken away at any moment. "What happened to put you in that position?" Grant asked, sipping his coffee. Between bites, Vivian told him about her father, a once respected merchant who had turned to gambling and drink after her mother's death 5 years earlier. How he had mortgaged their home, sold their store, and finally accrued debts he could never repay. How he had died in his sleep after a particularly heavy night of drinking, leaving her with nothing but his unpaid obligations. "The creditors came immediately," she said, pushing her empty bowl aside. "They took everything. When there was nothing left, they said I would have to work off the debt. I thought they meant as a servant or laundress, but—" Her voice broke. "But they had other ideas," Grant finished for her. Vivian nodded, fighting back tears. "I have an aunt in Denver." "If I could get to her, I'll take you," Grant said without hesitation. "I'm headed that way myself." "Mr. Wilson, you've already done too much. I couldn't ask. You're not asking. I'm offering." He placed enough money on the table to cover their meal and a generous tip. "The stagecoach leaves tomorrow morning. Until then, you'll need a safe place to stay." Grant arranged a room for Vivian at the town's respectable boarding house, paid for by him but with strict instructions to the matron that she was to be left alone and treated with dignity. He himself took a room at the saloon across town, promising to collect her for the stagecoach at dawn. That night, alone in a clean bed for the first time in days, Vivian found sleep elusive. Her mind kept returning to the man who had saved her. Grant Wilson was unlike any man she had ever met. There was a quiet strength about him, an integrity that seemed to come from some deep well of experience, both good and bad. She wondered what had shaped him into the kind of man who would spend a small fortune to rescue a stranger. Dawn arrived with a soft knock at her door. Vivian had little to pack, just the faded dress she wore, and a small locket containing miniature portraits of her parents, the only item she had managed to conceal from the creditors. Grant waited patiently in the boarding house parlor, looking as if he had slept no better than she had. "Ready?" he asked, standing when she entered. "As I'll ever be," she replied with a faint smile. The stagecoach journey would take 3 days to reach Denver. As they settled into their seats, Vivian noticed Grant scanning the other passengers with a watchful eye. There was a middle-aged couple, a traveling salesman, and an older woman who introduced herself as a schoolteacher returning home after visiting her sister. The first few hours passed in polite conversation. Grant spoke little, answering direct questions but offering nothing about himself. By midday, when they stopped to change horses at a way station, Vivian had learned that the couple was traveling to visit their first grandchild. The salesman specialized in women's beauty products, and the schoolteacher had never married because she believed education was her true calling. As they continued their journey, the conversation turned to the changing landscape of the West. The salesman complained about the difficulties of traveling between settlements, while the older gentleman spoke wistfully of the days before the war. Things are changing, Grant commented, surprising Vivian by joining the conversation. The railroad's pushing further west each year. Towns are growing. Laws following bit by bit. Is that good or bad in your estimation, young man? Asked the schoolteacher. Grant's eyes met Vivian's briefly before he answered. Depends on who's writing the laws and who they're meant to protect. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Vivian found herself watching Grant more closely. There was something in his expression when he spoke of law and protection that hinted at personal experience. That night, they stopped at a roadside inn. Grant ensured Vivian had a room to herself, while he shared accommodations with the salesman. Before retiring, they sat together in the small dining room, the only ones remaining after the other passengers had gone to bed. You should get some rest, Grant said, noticing how she stifled a yawn. In a moment, Vivian replied. Mr. Wilson, we've been traveling together all day and I still know nothing about you except your name. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Not much to tell. I think there is, she persisted gently. A man doesn't do what you did today without having a story of his own. Grant was silent for so long that Vivian thought he might not answer. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on something distant. I was a lawman once, he said. Deputy marshal in Kansas Territory after the war, saw things that would turn your stomach. Did things too, some necessary, some. He shook his head. Some I still see when I close my eyes at night. What happened? Vivian asked softly. I believed in the badge, thought it meant something. His voice hardened. Then I watched men with more authority than me use the law to take what they wanted, hurt who they wanted. Watched them auction off a young widow's land after her husband was killed, land that was rightfully hers. When I tried to stop it, I found out just how thin the line between lawman and outlaw can be. They forced you out. They tried to put me in the ground, he said matter-of-factly. I've been moving ever since. Taking odd jobs, ranch work mostly, keeping to myself. Until today, Vivian observed. Grant met her eyes. Until today. The following morning brought heavy rain, turning the roads to mud and slowing their progress considerably. By noon, the driver announced they would have to stop at the next town and wait for conditions to improve. The small settlement of Willow Creek consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a modest inn. Grant seemed on edge as they disembarked, his eyes scanning the muddy street with heightened alertness. Stay close, he murmured to Vivian as they entered the inn. What's wrong? She whispered. Probably nothing, he replied, but his hand stayed near his revolver as he arranged for rooms. That evening, as they ate a simple meal in the inn's dining room, Grant's tension was palpable. Vivian was about to ask him about it again when the door swung open, bringing with it a gust of rain-soaked air and three rough-looking men. They stomped their boots and shook water from their hats, laughing loudly. Grant went very still, his back to the door. Vivian watched as he slowly set down his fork and shifted slightly in his chair, positioning himself to see the newcomers in the reflection of a mirror on the opposite wall. It's been a while, Wilson, came a gravelly voice from behind them. Grant didn't turn. Not long enough, Hardin. The man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Heard you were dead, disappointed, just surprised. You always were hard to kill. The other patrons in the dining room had gone quiet, sensing the tension. The innkeeper stood frozen behind the counter, his eyes darting between Grant and the three men. We've got no quarrel here, Hardin, Grant said evenly. I'm just passing through with the lady. We'll be gone tomorrow. Hardin stepped closer, flanked by his companions. He was a barrel-chested man with a pockmarked face and cold eyes. Thing is, there's still money on your head in certain circles, dead or alive, as they say. Vivian's heart pounded as she realized the danger they were in. Grant had enemies, dangerous ones, and now she was caught in the middle of whatever history existed between these men. "Miss Parker," Grant said without taking his eyes off the mirror, "I think you should retire to your room now." "I don't think the lady's going anywhere," Hardin said, placing a hand on Vivian's shoulder. What happened next occurred so quickly that Vivian could barely follow it. Grant was out of his chair in a flash, his elbow connecting with Hardin's face with a sickening crack. As Hardin stumbled backward, Grant drew his revolver and had it trained on the other two men before they could clear their holsters. "Touch her again, and they'll be burying what's left of you come morning," Grant said, his voice deadly calm. Blood poured from Hardin's nose as he glared at Grant. "You always did have a soft spot for damsels, Wilson. It'll get you killed one day, maybe, but not today." Grant backed away, keeping his revolver steady. "Miss Parker, behind me, please." Vivian moved quickly, her legs shaking so badly she wondered how they supported her. "We're leaving," Grant told the men. "Don't follow." They backed out of the dining room and down the hallway to their rooms. Once inside Vivian's room, Grant locked the door and moved to the window, peering out at the rain-soaked street. "We can't stay here," he said, turning to her. "Those men won't let this go. We need to leave tonight. In this weather, the stagecoach won't run until, not by stagecoach. There's a livery stable at the edge of town. We'll need horses." Vivian sank onto the bed, the reality of their situation hitting her. "Those men want to kill you." Grant's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry you've been dragged into this, Miss Parker. I didn't expect to run into anyone from my past here." "Who are they?" "Bounty hunters of a sort. Hardin used to work for the men I crossed in Kansas." Grant moved away from the window. "Pack your things. We leave in 20 minutes. "Mr. Wilson," Vivian said, standing, "you saved me from that auction block. Whatever danger we're in now, we're in it together." Something flickered in Grant's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or respect. He nodded once, then slipped out to his own room to gather his belongings. True to his word, 20 minutes later they were slipping out the back door of the inn into the pouring rain. Grant led her through the shadows, avoiding the main street, until they reached the livery stable. The stableman was reluctant to rent horses in such weather, but the sight of extra coins quickly changed his mind. They rode out of Willow Creek under cover of darkness, the rain soaking them to the skin within minutes. Grant led them off the main road, following a narrow trail that wound through dense woods. "Where are we going?" Vivian called over the storm. "There's a trapper's cabin a few miles north of here," Grant replied, barely audible over the rain. "We can shelter there until morning, then cut across country to intercept the stagecoach route further on." The cabin, when they finally reached it, was little more than a one-room shack with a leaking roof and dirt floor, but it offered shelter from the worst of the storm. Grant quickly built a fire in the small stone hearth while Vivian wrung water from her sodden dress as best she could. "You should get out of those wet clothes," Grant said, keeping his back to her as he tended the fire. "There's an old blanket on that shelf. It's not much, but it's dry." Vivian retrieved the rough woolen blanket and moved to the darkest corner of the cabin. "Don't look," she instructed, though she noted that Grant had been a perfect gentleman thus far. "You have my word," he replied, continuing to face the fire. She changed quickly, hanging her dress near the hearth to dry, then wrapped herself in the blanket and sat on a wooden stool near the fire. Grant removed his own soaked coat and shirt, hanging them beside her dress, but kept his undershirt on despite its dampness. As the fire grew stronger, warmth slowly returned to Vivian's limbs. She watched Grant as he moved about the cabin, checking the single window and barring the door with a wooden plank he found leaning against the wall. "You think they followed us?" she asked. Not in this weather, but Hardin's persistent. He'll pick up our trail come morning. Grant sat on the floor near the fire, his back against the wall where he could see both the door and window. We should be gone by first light. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain hammer against the roof and the occasional drip of water through the ceiling into a rusted bucket in the corner. "Why is there a price on your head?" Vivian finally asked. Grant sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "I told you about that widow whose land was being auctioned off. What I didn't tell you was that she was married to my best friend. He was killed trying to stop a bank robbery doing his job as a deputy. The men who arranged the auction were the same ones who ran the town, the mayor, the judge, the banker. They wanted her land because they'd discovered gold on the neighboring property. What did you do?" "I gathered evidence of their corruption, was going to take it to the federal marshal." His jaw tightened. "They found out, came to arrest me on false charges. There was a fight. The mayor's son drew on me and I shot him. He lived, but they branded me an outlaw, put a bounty on me, $500 dead or alive." "That's why you had $1,000 to spend at the auction," Vivian realized. "You've been saving to stay ahead of the bounty." Grant's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "Ironic, isn't it? Spent years saving that money in case I needed to buy my freedom someday. Ended up using it to buy yours instead." Vivian moved closer to him, drawn by something in his voice. "You regret it?" "No," he said without hesitation, meeting her eyes. "Not for a second." The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the relentless rain outside. Something was changing between them, something Vivian wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. "We should try to get some sleep," Grant said, breaking the moment. "Tomorrow will be a long day." He insisted she take the cabin's single cot, while he would keep watch from his position by the wall. Despite her exhaustion, Vivian found sleep elusive, her mind replaying the events of the day and wondering what tomorrow would bring. She woke to gray dawn light filtering through the cabin's dirty window. Grant was already up, heating coffee in a battered pot he'd found on a shelf. Their clothes, though still damp, were wearable again. "The rain's stopped," he said, handing her a tin cup of coffee. "But the trails will be muddy. We'll need to move carefully." They ate a sparse breakfast of jerky Grant had in his saddlebag, then prepared to leave. As Vivian was dressing behind the privacy of the blanket strung across a corner, she heard Grant curse softly. "What is it?" she asked, hurriedly finishing with her buttons. "Riders," he said, peering through the window. "3 of them coming up the trail." "Hardin," Grant nodded grimly. "They're faster than I expected. We need to go. Now." They slipped out the back of the cabin and hurried to where they had sheltered the horses in a small lean-to. As they mounted, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. "This way," Grant said, leading them into the dense forest behind the cabin. They rode hard through the trees, the ground treacherous with mud and hidden roots. Behind them, shouts indicated that Hardin and his men had discovered their escape. Shots rang out, bullets splintering bark from trees nearby. "Keep going," Grant called, dropping back slightly to cover their retreat. Vivian urged her horse forward, ducking low branches and navigating the difficult terrain as best she could. She had grown up riding. Her father had owned horses before his gambling consumed everything, but this desperate flight through unfamiliar woodland tested her skills to their limit. A sharp cry behind her made her turn in the saddle. Grant was still mounted, but his left arm hung awkwardly, blood darkening his sleeve. "You're hit," she gasped. "It's nothing," he ground out. "Keep moving." They broke from the forest onto a rocky ridge overlooking a fast-moving river swollen with rainwater. The path ahead narrowed dangerously, barely wide enough for a horse. "We have to cross," Grant said, pointing to where the river narrowed between two rocky outcroppings. "It's our only chance to lose them." "That water's too high," Vivian protested. "We'll be swept away." More gunshots echoed behind them, closer now. "We don't have a choice," Grant insisted. "Follow me, stay close to the rocks." He urged his horse forward, picking his way carefully along the ridge until they reached the narrowest point of the river. The water raged below, brown with mud and debris from the storm. "Ready," he called over the roar of the water. Vivian nodded, her throat too tight with fear to speak. Grant led his horse into the rushing current, fighting to keep the animal steady as the water rose to its chest. Vivian followed, gasping as the icy water soaked her boots and skirts. Her horse snorted in fear, trying to turn back, but she held it firmly, keeping her eyes fixed on Grant's back ahead of her. Halfway across, disaster struck. A large branch carried by the current slammed into Grant's horse, causing it to lose its footing. Both horse and rider went under, swept downstream in an instant. "Grant!" Vivian screamed, forgetting all formality in her terror. She caught a glimpse of him surfacing, fighting the current before her own horse stumbled. Suddenly, she too was in the water, the cold so intense it stole her breath. The current pulled her under, tumbling her over and over until she no longer knew which way was up. Her lungs burned for air, her skirts wrapped around her legs like chains pulling her down. Just as spots began to dance before her eyes, strong arms encircled her waist, pulling her upward. They broke the surface together, Grant holding her tightly as he struggled toward the shore with his one good arm. "Breathe," he commanded as they collapsed on a muddy bank some distance downstream. "Just breathe." Vivian coughed violently, expelling water from her lungs while Grant collapsed beside her, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. Both horses were gone, along with their few possessions. "Are you hurt?" Grant asked when she could breathe again. She shook her head, then noticed his arm. The bullet wound was still bleeding, washed clean by the river but looking angry and painful. "Your arm, we need to keep moving," he interrupted, struggling to his feet. "They might have crossed upstream." "You need a doctor," Vivian insisted, rising unsteadily. "What I need is to get you to safety," Grant countered. "There's a town about 5 miles east of here. If we can reach it by nightfall." A distant shout cut him off. On the ridge above, barely visible through the trees, were Hardin and his men. "They didn't cross," Grant muttered. "They're tracking us along the bank. Come on." They plunged into the forest again, moving as quickly as their sodden clothes and exhaustion would allow. Grant was clearly struggling, his wound sapping his strength with every step, but he refused to slow their pace. As the afternoon wore on, Vivian noticed with growing alarm that Grant was becoming unsteady, occasionally stumbling over obstacles he should have easily avoided. When he finally collapsed against a tree, she knew they could go no further. "We need to rest," she said firmly. "Can't," he mumbled, his eyes unfocused. "They'll find us." "You're burning with fever," Vivian said, placing her hand on his forehead. "The wound's infected. We have to find shelter and tend to it." Grant tried to protest, but he lacked the strength to argue. With Vivian supporting him, they continued at a slower pace until they came upon an abandoned hunter's blind, little more than a low stone wall with a partial roof of branches, but better than nothing. Vivian helped Grant lie down, then tore a strip from her petticoat to bind his wound. "I need to find water and something for the fever," she said. "Will you be all right if I leave you for a short time?" Grant's eyes cleared momentarily. "Too dangerous," he murmured. "Hardin is looking for both of us together," she finished for him. "One person moving carefully is harder to spot. I won't go far." Before he could protest further, she slipped away, moving as quietly as she could through the underbrush. A small stream provided clean water, which she carried back in Grant's hat that had somehow stayed with him through the river crossing. She also found some willow bark, which her mother had taught her could help reduce fever. When she returned, Grant was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. Vivian tore more strips from her petticoat to clean the wound properly, then made a bitter tea from the willow bark using the last of the matches Grant had in a waterproof pouch on his belt. Night fell as she worked, the forest growing dark and full of unfamiliar sounds. Vivian kept vigil beside Grant, periodically helping him drink the willow bark tea or bathing his forehead with cool water from the stream. His fever rose steadily, and he muttered in his delirium, sometimes calling out names she didn't recognize, sometimes apologizing for failures she couldn't understand. In the darkest hours of the night, when his fever peaked, he grasped her hand with surprising strength. "Elizabeth," he whispered. "No, it's Vivian," she corrected gently, his eyes opened, unfocused but desperate. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I tried, Elizabeth, I tried." Vivian's heart ached for him. "Who is Elizabeth?" she asked softly. "My wife," he murmured before slipping back into unconsciousness. The revelation stunned her. Grant had never mentioned a wife. Was she still waiting for him somewhere? Or was she the widow he had tried to help, his best friend's wife, as he had described her? The questions swirled in Vivian's mind as she continued her vigil through the night. By dawn, Grant's fever had broken. He woke, weak but lucid, to find Vivian dozing beside him, her hand still holding his. "Vivian," he said hoarsely. She startled awake. "You're better," she said with relief. "The fever's gone, thanks to you." His eyes held hers for a long moment. "You saved my life." "You saved mine first," she reminded him with a small smile. "Consider us even." Grant tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in his arm. "We should move." "Hardin would have found us by now if he was going to," Vivian said. "I think we lost them at the river." "Maybe," Grant conceded. "But we can't stay here. We're still days from Denver with no horses and little food." "The town you mentioned yesterday, Clearwater. Yes, we should be able to reach it by midday if we start now." Despite Vivian's protests that he needed more rest, Grant insisted they continue their journey. She helped him to his feet and they set off eastward, moving slowly but steadily through the forest. As they walked, Vivian found herself watching Grant with new eyes. Who was this man, really? A former lawman turned fugitive, a widower perhaps, a man willing to spend his life savings to save a stranger. The more she learned about him, the more questions she had. "Last night," she began carefully, "during your fever, you mentioned someone named Elizabeth." Grant's stride faltered slightly. "Did I? You called me by her name, said she was your wife." He was silent for so long that Vivian thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low and tight with old pain. "Elizabeth was my wife. She died 6 years ago, childbirth. The baby, too." "I'm sorry," Vivian said, her heart aching for him. "You must have loved her very much." "I did." His jaw tightened. "After I lost them, the badge was all I had left. Thought if I could uphold the law, protect others, it might give their death some meaning." "And then those men corrupted even that," Vivian realized. Grant nodded. "When I saw you on that auction block, something just broke loose inside me. Couldn't stand by and watch another innocent life destroyed by men with power and no conscience." They walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The forest began to thin, giving way to rolling hills covered in tall grass still wet with morning dew. "Look," Grant said, pointing ahead. "Smoke. That must be Clearwater." The small town appeared before them as they crested a hill, a collection of wooden buildings along a main street, with scattered farmhouses on the outskirts. Smoke rose from chimneys, and they could make out people moving about their daily business. "We must look a sight," Vivian said, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. Her once fine dress was torn and mud-stained, her hair a tangled mess. "We look like we've been through hell," Grant agreed with a wry smile. "But we're alive." They approached the town cautiously, alert for any sign of Hardin and his men. The first building they came to was a blacksmith's shop, where a burly man was shoeing a horse. "Excuse me," Grant called, his voice stronger than Vivian expected given his condition. "Is there a doctor in town?" The blacksmith looked up, his eyes widening at their appearance. "Doc Miller's just down the street. What happened to you folks?" "River crossing gone wrong," Grant said, offering no further explanation. "Much obliged." The doctor, a graying man with kind eyes, took one look at Grant's arm and ushered them both inside his small office. "Bullet wound," he observed, examining the injury. "And a nasty infection. You're lucky to be alive, mister." "I had good care," Grant said, his eyes meeting Vivian's. While the doctor cleaned and properly bandaged the wound, Vivian explained that they had lost their horses and belongings in the river crossing, carefully omitting any mention of Hardin or why they had been fleeing. "Well, you're welcome to stay at my house until you're back on your feet, Doctor," Miller offered. "My wife will be glad for the company, and you look like you could use a few good meals, young lady." Vivian felt tears spring to her eyes at this simple kindness. "Thank you, Doctor. You're very generous." The Millers proved to be as kind as the doctor had suggested. Mrs. Miller, a plump, motherly woman, immediately set about providing them with clean clothes, her husband's for Grant, and some of her daughters who was away teaching school for Vivian. She fed them a hearty meal of stew and fresh bread, then showed them to separate rooms where they could rest. For the first time in days, Vivian slept in a real bed, clean and safe. When she woke, the afternoon sun was slanting through the curtains. She found Mrs. Miller in the kitchen, kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. "Your husband's still sleeping," Mrs. Miller said with a warm smile. "Doctor says he needs the rest to heal properly." Vivian opened her mouth to correct the assumption that Grant was her husband, then stopped. Perhaps it was safer this way, given the circumstances. "Yes, he's been through a lot," she said instead. "Well, you both have, from the looks of things," Mrs. Miller replied, giving the dough a final punch. "Don't worry, dear, you're safe here." Over the next few days, Grant regained his strength while Vivian helped Mrs. Miller with household chores to repay their host's kindness. In the evenings, they all sat in the parlor, where Dr. Miller read from the newspaper or shared stories of his 40 years as a country doctor. On the third night, after the Millers had retired, Vivian and Grant remained in the parlor, sitting in comfortable silence before the dying fire. "We should leave tomorrow," Grant said eventually. "I've imposed on their kindness long enough." "Are you sure you're strong enough?" Vivian asked, noting the way he still favored his injured arm. "Strong enough to travel, Doctor." "Miller says there's a stagecoach that passes through here twice a week, headed for Denver. Tomorrow's one of those days." Vivian nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of uncertainty in her stomach. Once they reached Denver, she would go to her aunt's home and Grant. What would Grant do? Continue his solitary existence, always looking over his shoulder for Hardin or other bounty hunters. The thought made her inexplicably sad. "What will you do after Denver?" she asked quietly. Grant considered the question. "Not sure. Keep moving, I suppose. That's been my life for 5 years now." "Doesn't it get lonely?" His eyes met hers, and something passed between them that made her breath catch. "Yes," he said simply, "it does." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken words. Then Grant looked away, breaking the connection. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Vivian rose, but paused beside his chair. Impulsively, she leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Before he could respond, she hurried from the room, her heart pounding in her chest. What was happening to her? This man had saved her, protected her, risked his life for her, but she barely knew him. And yet, something about Grant Wilson called to her in a way no man ever had before. The stagecoach arrived in Clearwater just after noon the following day. Grant had used some of the money he still carried in his boot, untouched by the river, to purchase tickets to Denver and new clothes for both of them. Vivian now wore a simple but clean dress provided by the town's general store, while Grant had replaced his ruined shirt and coat. They said goodbye to the Millers with heartfelt thanks and promises to write once they were settled in Denver. As they boarded the stagecoach, Vivian was acutely aware that their journey together was nearing its end. The coach was nearly empty, just an elderly couple who introduced themselves as the Hendersons, traveling to Denver to live with their son. Mr. Henderson was hard of hearing, and Mrs. Henderson spent most of the journey shouting information into his ear, leaving Vivian and Grant to their own thoughts. They traveled through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing from forests to more open plains. Grant remained vigilant, scanning the horizon frequently for any sign of pursuit, but there was no indication that Hardin had tracked them to Clearwater. As evening approached, the stagecoach stopped at a way station where they would spend the night before continuing to Denver the following day. The station was little more than a sturdy log building with a few rooms for travelers, a dining area, and quarters for the stagecoach driver and station keeper. After a simple supper, the Hendersons retired early, leaving Vivian and Grant alone in the small common room. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting warm light over the rough wooden furniture. "One more day to Denver," Vivian said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Grant nodded, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Your aunt will be glad to see you." "I haven't seen her in years," Vivian admitted. "Not since before my mother died. I'm not even certain she knows about my father's passing." "Family is family," Grant said. "She'll take you in." "And you?" Vivian asked, gathering her courage. "What awaits you in Denver?" Grant shrugged. "Nothing specific. It's just another stop." "It doesn't have to be," Vivian said softly. He looked at her then, his green eyes reflecting the firelight. "What do you mean?" Vivian moved to sit beside him on the rough-hewn bench. "I mean that perhaps you don't have to keep running. Perhaps there's another way. The bounty on my head could be resolved," she finished for him. "You said yourself that the West is changing. There must be honest lawmen, federal marshals who would listen to your story, look at evidence." Grant shook his head. "I've been running too long. The story's grown with telling I'm probably wanted for more than I actually did by now." "Then we'll clear your name," Vivian said with determination. "My aunt knows people in Denver, influential people. Her late husband was a judge." "Why would you do that for me?" Grant asked, his voice low. Vivian met his gaze steadily. "Because you risked everything for me when you didn't even know me. Because you're a good man who deserves justice. Because—" She faltered, then found her courage again. "Because I care what happens to you, Grant Wilson." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes. "Vivian," he began, but whatever he meant to say was interrupted by a commotion outside. The sound of horses approaching at speed broke the moment. Grant was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "Riders," he said grimly. "4 of them." "Hardin?" Vivian asked, fear clutching at her heart. "Can't tell yet." Grant checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded. "Stay here, away from the windows." He moved to the door, easing it open slightly to peer outside. The station keeper was already on the porch, calling out to the approaching riders. "Who comes at this hour?" "U.S. Marshals," came the reply. "We're tracking fugitives." Have you seen a man and woman pass through here? Man's tall, dark hair, wounded in the left arm. Woman's blonde, early 20s. Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. Not bounty hunters, lawmen. Which meant Grant was wanted by more than just Hardin and his employers. Grant closed the door quietly and turned to her, his expression grim. "I have to go," he said. "Now." "They're marshals," Vivian protested. "We could explain, no time," Grant cut her off. "If they're working with the men from Kansas, they won't listen to explanations." He moved to the back door of the station house. "There's a window in the kitchen. I can slip out that way, get to the stables." "I'm coming with you," Vivian said, grabbing her shawl. Grant shook his head. "No, you'll be safer here. Go to Denver to your aunt. Forget you ever met me." "I won't," Vivian said fiercely, stepping closer to him. "I'm not letting you disappear into the night. Not after everything we've been through." Outside, they could hear the station keeper inviting the marshals in. They had minutes, perhaps seconds. Grant looked at her for a long moment, conflict clear in his eyes. Then, with sudden decisiveness, he pulled her to him and kissed her a brief, fierce kiss that left her breathless. "I'll find you in Denver," he promised. "Give me 2 weeks. If I don't come, it means I couldn't." Before she could respond, he was gone, slipping through the kitchen and out the window. Vivian stood frozen, her lips still tingling from his kiss, as the front door opened and 4 men in long dusters entered, stars gleaming on their chests. The lead marshal, a weathered man with a silver mustache, surveyed the room. His eyes settled on Vivian. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat, "we're looking for a fugitive named Grant Wilson. We have reason to believe he's traveling with a young woman. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" Vivian forced herself to remain calm. "No, sir," she lied. "I'm traveling alone to Denver to stay with my aunt." The marshal studied her face. "You certain about that, miss? Harboring a fugitive is a serious offense." "I'm quite certain," Vivian replied steadily. "I've been traveling on the stagecoach with the Hendersons. They're asleep now, but you're welcome to ask them in the morning." The marshal seemed about to question her further when one of his deputies called from the kitchen. "Marshal, back door's unlatched. And there are boot prints in the mud outside." The marshal's eyes narrowed. "Search the grounds," he ordered. "He can't have gone far." As the deputies hurried out, the marshal turned back to Vivian. "Miss, I don't know what Wilson told you, but he's a dangerous man. Wanted for killing a mayor's son in Kansas and resisting arrest. If you know where he's headed, it would be better for all concerned if you told me now." Vivian lifted her chin. "As I said, Marshal, I'm traveling alone. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's been a long day and I'd like to retire." The marshal frowned but stepped aside to let her pass. "We'll be staying here tonight, miss. If you remember anything that might help us, I'd appreciate you coming forward." Vivian nodded curtly and made her way to the small room she had been assigned. Once inside, she pressed her ear to the door, listening to the marshals as they organized their search of the grounds. She heard horses galloping away, deputies sent to search the surrounding area. She guessed. Sleep was impossible. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed, watching the window, half hoping that Grant might appear there. But the night passed slowly with no sign of him. By dawn, she was exhausted but determined. Whatever happened, she would reach Denver and find a way to help Grant clear his name. The marshals remained at the way station when the stagecoach departed the next morning, questioning the driver about Grant and showing him a crude wanted poster. Vivian kept her eyes down, pretending to read a book she had borrowed from Mrs. Miller. The Hendersons, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them, chatted happily about their son's new home in Denver. The journey passed in a blur of anxiety for Vivian. Had Grant escaped? Was he safe? Would he really come to Denver as he had promised? Or was that just something he had said in the heat of the moment? And what of the kiss? The memory of it warmed her even as uncertainty gnawed at her. Grant had lost his wife in tragic circumstances. He had spent years alone, running from his past. Could he really be ready to stop running, to trust again, to possibly love again? Denver appeared on the horizon late in the afternoon, a growing city sprawling at the foot of the majestic Rocky Mountains. Smoke rose from factories and homes, and the gleaming tracks of the railroad cut through the landscape. It was a far cry from the small town where Vivian had grown up, and for a moment she felt overwhelmed by the prospect of finding her way in this bustling metropolis. The stagecoach delivered them to the central depot, where Vivian said goodbye to the Hendersons and hired a cab to take her to her aunt's address. As the cab wound through the city streets, she gazed out at the mixture of elegant homes and rough establishments that characterized Denver in 1875, a city caught between frontier rawness and growing sophistication. Her aunt's home was in one of the better neighborhoods, a handsome two-story brick house with a small but well-tended garden. Vivian paid the cab driver with the last of the money Grant had given her, then squared her shoulders and approached the front door. The woman who answered her knock was older than Vivian remembered her mother's younger sister, now in her late 40s, with strands of gray in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. "Yes," she said, not recognizing Vivian at first. "Aunt Margaret," Vivian said, suddenly nervous. "It's me, Vivian Parker." Margaret's eyes widened in shock, then filled with tears. "Vivian, my God, child, is it really you?" She pulled Vivian into a fierce embrace. Come in at once. What on earth are you doing in Denver?" "Where is your father?" Over tea in Margaret's comfortable parlor, Vivian told her aunt about her father's death and the events that had led to her being put up for auction. She carefully edited the story of her journey to Denver, mentioning only that kind strangers had helped her along the way and omitting any reference to Grant. "That's absolutely dreadful," Margaret said when she had finished. "To think that my own niece could be treated in such a barbaric manner. If I had known, I would have come for you immediately." "There was no way you could have known," Vivian assured her. "Father and I lost touch with everyone after Mother died." "Well, you're here now," Margaret said firmly, "and this is your home for as long as you wish it to be. My Charles has been gone these 5 years, and the house is too big for just me. I've been thinking of taking in a companion, but having family is far better." Vivian felt tears sting her eyes at this unconditional acceptance. "Thank you, Aunt Margaret. I don't know what I would have done otherwise." Margaret patted her hand. "No need to think of that now. You're safe, and that's what matters. Now you must be exhausted. Let me show you to your room and we can talk more tomorrow." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Margaret insisted on taking Vivian shopping for a new wardrobe, introducing her to her circle of friends, and generally integrating her into Denver society. Vivian was grateful for her aunt's generosity, but her thoughts were never far from Grant. Each day, she watched the street from her bedroom window, hoping to catch a glimpse of a tall figure in a weathered Stetson. As the 2-week mark approached, Vivian grew increasingly anxious. She had made discreet inquiries about U.S. marshals in the area, learning that the men who had come to the way station were indeed legitimate lawmen, not impostors working for Hardin or his employers. This gave her hope perhaps Grant could clear his name after all, if the right people heard his story. On the 14th day, Margaret announced at breakfast that they would be attending a dinner party that evening at the home of Judge William Harrington, one of the most respected jurists in Colorado Territory. "It will be the perfect opportunity to introduce you to Denver society properly," Margaret said, buttering her toast. Judge Harrington is a dear friend, and his wife throws the most elegant parties. Vivian nodded absently, her mind on Grant. This was the last day of his promised 2 weeks. If he didn't come today. Vivian, are you listening, dear? I'm sorry, Aunt Margaret, Vivian said, forcing a smile. Yes, the dinner party sounds lovely. That afternoon, as Vivian was helping her aunt prepare for the evening, a knock came at the front door. Margaret's housekeeper answered it, then appeared in the parlor doorway. Miss Parker, there's a gentleman asking for you, she said, her expression suggesting she found the visitor somewhat dubious. He wouldn't give his name. Vivian's heart leaped. Thank you, Mrs. Collins, I'll see him. She hurried to the front hall, her aunt following with a puzzled expression. There, standing awkwardly in the entryway, was Grant Wilson. He was clean-shaven, his hair trimmed, wearing new clothes that fit his tall frame well, but it was unmistakably him. His left arm was still held carefully, but otherwise he looked healthy and whole. Grant, Vivian breathed, unable to keep the joy from her voice. He removed his hat, a new one that hadn't seen the rough treatment of his old Stetson. Miss Parker, he said formally, aware of Margaret's presence. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Vivian said, then remembered her manners. Aunt Margaret, this is Mr. Grant Wilson. He helped me on my journey to Denver. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but her manners were impeccable. Mr. Wilson, how kind of you to call. Please come into the parlor. Once they were seated, an awkward silence fell. Grant cleared his throat. I wanted to ensure that Miss Parker arrived safely and is comfortably settled. Very thoughtful, Margaret said, studying him with interest. And what brings you to Denver, Mr. Wilson? Grant glanced at Vivian, who gave him an encouraging nod. Actually, madam, I'm here to clear my name. I've been wrongfully accused of crimes in Kansas territory, and I'm told Denver has lawyers and judges who might be willing to hear my case fairly. Margaret's interest visibly increased. Indeed. What sort of crimes, if you don't mind my asking? Grant hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty was the best approach. I was a deputy marshal in Kansas. I discovered corruption among town officials who were illegally seizing land. When I tried to expose them, they framed me for attempted murder. I've been a fugitive since then. I see, Margaret said, her expression thoughtful. And you have evidence of this corruption? Some, Grant admitted. Not as much as I'd like. The fire that killed the mayor and judge destroyed most of the records, but I managed to save a few documents. Vivian gasped. The mayor and judge are dead. You never told me that, Grant nodded grimly. It happened after I fled. A fire at the town hall. Some say it was an accident, others that it was set to destroy evidence. Either way, the 2 men most responsible for my situation are beyond earthly justice now. Margaret was silent for a long moment, considering. Then she smiled. Mr. Wilson, we are attending a dinner party this evening at the home of Judge William Harrington. He is one of the most respected judicial minds in the territory and a man of impeccable integrity. I think he would be very interested in hearing your story. Grant looked stunned. You would do that for me? You barely know me. I know that you helped my niece when she needed it most, Margaret replied, and I have been a judge's wife long enough to recognize when a man is telling the truth. The dinner is at 7. I suggest you join us. After Margaret excused herself to continue preparations for the evening, Vivian and Grant were left alone in the parlor. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the reality of being reunited after 2 weeks of uncertainty sinking in. You came, Vivian said softly. I promised I would. Grant leaned forward, his eyes intense. It wasn't easy. The marshals nearly caught me twice. But I made it to Denver, found a decent boarding house, and spent the last week trying to figure out how to approach clearing my name. I never expected this kind of opportunity. My aunt is remarkable, Vivian agreed. Once she decides to help someone, she commits fully. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. What about Hardin? Is he still tracking you? Grant's expression darkened. Hardin won't be a problem anymore. He caught up to me the night I left the way station. We had a disagreement. You killed him? Vivian asked, alarmed. No, Grant said quickly. But I did convince him that continuing to hunt me was bad for his health. I also pointed out that with the mayor and judge dead, there was no one left to pay the bounty on my head. Vivian felt relief wash over her. So if you can clear your name with the federal authorities, then I might be able to stop running, Grant finished. Start living again. Their eyes met, and the memory of that brief, desperate kiss at the way station hung between them. Vivian longed to ask what it had meant to him, whether he had thought of her as she had thought of him these past 2 weeks, but this wasn't the time or place. I should go, Grant said, rising. I need to make myself presentable for a judge's dinner party. Yes, of course, Vivian said, standing as well. She walked him to the door, conscious of Mrs. Collins watching discreetly from the hallway. At the threshold, Grant paused. Vivian, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, that night at the way station. I meant what I said, and what I did. Her heart soared at his words. I'll see you this evening, Mr. Wilson, she said formally, for the benefit of the housekeeper, but her eyes conveyed much more. Grant nodded, understanding. Until then, Miss Parker. The dinner party at Judge Harrington's mansion was everything Margaret had promised: elegant, well attended by Denver's elite, and a perfect opportunity for Grant to present his case to influential ears. Vivian, dressed in a new gown of deep blue silk that Margaret had insisted on purchasing for her, found herself watching with pride as Grant conversed confidently with the judge and several prominent attorneys. You're Mr. Wilson is quite impressive, Margaret murmured, appearing at Vivian's side with a glass of punch. The judge is fascinated by his story. He's not my Mr. Wilson, Vivian protested weakly. Margaret's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. Not yet, perhaps. But I've seen the way you look at each other. There's a story there that you haven't told me, niece. Vivian blushed. It's complicated, Aunt Margaret. The best love stories usually are, her aunt replied. Ah, they're calling us in to dinner. It appears the judge has seated Mr. Wilson beside him. That's a very good sign. Throughout the elaborate meal, Vivian caught glimpses of Grant deep in conversation with Judge Harrington. By the time dessert was served, the judge was nodding thoughtfully and asking pointed questions that suggested he was taking Grant's situation seriously. After dinner, while the gentlemen enjoyed cigars and brandy in the judge's study, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room. Vivian was approached by a handsome young man who introduced himself as Lawrence Caldwell, the son of a prominent banker. Miss Parker, I understand you're new to Denver, he said, his manner politely flirtatious. Perhaps you would allow me to show you some of our city's attractions. The theater, perhaps, or a ride through the park. Before Vivian could formulate a response, she felt a presence at her side. Grant had entered the drawing room and was looking at Lawrence with a neutral expression that nevertheless conveyed a clear message. Mr. Caldwell, Grant said with a nod. Mr. Wilson, Lawrence replied, looking between Grant and Vivian with dawning understanding. I see. Well, Miss Parker, it was a pleasure to meet you. Perhaps another time. As Lawrence moved away, Vivian turned to Grant with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. That was rather presumptuous of you, Mr. Wilson. Grant had the grace to look slightly abashed. Was it? My apologies. I didn't say I minded, Vivian replied softly. His eyes warmed at her words. The judge wants to meet with me tomorrow, along with a federal prosecutor he trusts. He thinks there's a strong case for clearing my name, especially since the main accusers are deceased and can't refute my evidence." "That's wonderful news," Vivian said, genuinely happy for him. "It's a start," Grant agreed. "But regardless of what happens with my legal situation, there's something I need to tell you, Vivian." The seriousness of his tone made her heart beat faster. "Yes. When I saw you on that auction block, something changed in me," he said, his voice low and intense. "For years, I've been just surviving, not living. Running, hiding, never letting myself get close to anyone. But you made me want to stop running. You made me remember what it feels like to care about someone, to want to protect them, to want to build something real." Vivian felt tears prick her eyes. "Grant, let me finish," he said gently. "I know we've only known each other a short time. I know there's still uncertainty ahead with my legal situation. I know I have little to offer right now beyond myself. But if you're willing, I'd like the chance to court you properly, to see if what I feel for you, what I think you might feel for me, could grow into something lasting." Vivian looked into his eyes, seeing all the pain of his past, but also hope for the future, a future that might include her. "I would like that very much," she whispered. The weeks that followed were transformative for both of them. Judge Harrington, true to his word, arranged meetings with federal authorities who were willing to review Grant's case. The evidence, while not complete due to the fire, was compelling enough to warrant a formal hearing. Grant's status as a fugitive was temporarily suspended while the investigation proceeded. During this time, Grant called at Margaret's home nearly every day. They went for walks in the park, attended concerts and lectures, and spent long hours simply talking. Vivian learned about his childhood in Ohio, his service in the Union Army during the Civil War, his marriage to Elizabeth, and their dreams of children and a homestead. Grant, in turn, listened as Vivian spoke of her mother's illness, her father's decline, and her own dreams of someday becoming a teacher. Margaret watched their courtship with approval, occasionally offering gentle guidance but mostly allowing their relationship to develop naturally. Denver society, taking its cue from the judge's wife, welcomed Grant despite his uncertain past. 3 months after that first dinner party, Grant received official word that all charges against him had been dismissed. Judge Harrington, who had become something of a mentor to Grant, offered him a position as a court officer, a role that would utilize his law enforcement experience while allowing him to remain in Denver. That evening, Grant took Vivian to dinner at the finest restaurant in the city. As they finished their meal, he reached across the table to take her hand. "I'm a free man now," he said, his voice full of wonder. "No more looking over my shoulder, no more running. I can build a life here." "I'm so happy for you," Vivian said, squeezing his hand. "There's just one thing missing," Grant continued, his expression growing serious. "One thing that would make that life complete." Vivian's heart began to race as Grant left his chair and knelt beside her table, drawing curious and delighted glances from nearby diners. "Vivian Parker," he said, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. "From the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you. It took me time to understand what that was, but now I know. It was my heart recognizing its home." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "Will you marry me? Will you make a home with me, have a family with me, grow old with me?" Tears of joy spilled down Vivian's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Grant Wilson, I will marry you." The restaurant erupted in applause as Grant slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her. A proper kiss this time. Not the desperate farewell of the way station, but a promise of all the kisses to come. They were married in the spring of 1876, in Judge Harrington's garden. Margaret gave the bride away, beaming with pride and joy for the niece who had become like a daughter to her. Grant stood tall and straight in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Vivian as she walked toward him in a gown of ivory satin. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to love and cherish, to support and protect, to build a life together based on mutual respect and unwavering devotion. As they exchanged rings, Vivian thought of how far they had come from that terrible day at the auction block, when a stranger had stepped forward and said she would never stand before strangers again. In the years that followed, Grant rose through the ranks of the court system, eventually becoming a respected bailiff known for his fairness and integrity. Vivian, with Margaret's encouragement, completed her education and became a teacher at a school for girls, specializing in helping young women from difficult circumstances find their path in life. They purchased a small house not far from Margaret's, with a garden where their children could play, first a son they named James, after Grant's father, and then twin daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, honoring the women who had shaped their lives. Margaret delighted in her role as honorary grandmother, spoiling the children shamelessly and filling their home with laughter and love. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Grant surprised Vivian with a trip back to Redemption, the town where they had first met. The place had changed, grown more respectable with the coming of the railroad and the influx of families looking to settle in the West. The spot where the auction block had once stood was now a small park, with a fountain and benches where townspeople gathered on pleasant days. As they stood looking at the transformation, Grant wrapped his arm around Vivian's waist. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked. "How different our lives might have been if I hadn't been passing through town at that exact moment." Vivian leaned her head against his shoulder. "Sometimes. But I prefer to think about everything that's happened since our home, our children, the life we've built together." Grant pressed a kiss to her temple. "When I made that promise that you would never stand before strangers again, I had no idea where it would lead. I just knew I couldn't walk away." "And now?" Vivian asked, turning in his arms to look up at him. "Now I know it was the best decision I ever made," Grant said, his eyes reflecting the same love she had seen in them that day in Judge Harrington's garden. "I love you, Vivian Wilson, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "My protector, my partner, my home." As they walked back to their hotel, hand in hand in the golden light of the setting sun, Vivian reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the depths of despair on that auction block to the heights of joy in their shared life, it had been a path neither of them could have imagined. But together, they had found not just safety and security, but a love that would sustain them through all the years to come, a love born in the wild frontier, but destined to flourish in the civilization they were helping to build. Grant squeezed her hand, as if reading her thoughts. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Vivian smiled up at the man who had saved her in more ways than one. "I am home," she said simply, "wherever you are." And as they walked together into the sunset, Vivian knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, just as they had from that first moment when a tall stranger had stepped forward from the crowd and changed her life forever.